All right, so it's 12:01. I'm sure some folks will join over the next 4 or 5 minutes. But I think we should get going, in part because we don't have much time. We do have a hard cutoff at 1, and we have too much to talk about. And so we're not going to be able to get through it. To start, I want to provide a quick overview of what we'll be doing today, what we'll be talking about. But first, the most important thing maybe is a thank you. So a thank you to everyone who's here in the audience with us. Certainly a thank you to the panelists who have been described to me with many, in many generous, particularly generous ways, including all-star panel, which I think is precisely right. Also co-sponsors, so both the AALS section on critical theories and BU's Office of Diversity and Inclusion are co-sponsoring this important talk. And there's a lot of folks behind the scenes at BU who have just done a lot of all the behind the scenes work to make this possible. So a thank you to all of you out there. So what are we going to do today? First, I'm going to do some super quick intros. I would encourage everyone to Google these names if you don't know them already. They are the best of the best. I'm then going to lay just a little bit of groundwork to set the stage so that we have some background, particularly for anyone who might be new to the conversation. And then we're going to shift to a structured conversation. I'm going to ask some questions directed to the panelists, some to the whole panel, but really with the goal of facilitating an organic conversation in which we are, chatting amongst each other. If we have time, I will do a little bit of Q&A. There's a Q&A box for anyone who wants to drop in a question. I will say up front, though, I'm not going to guarantee that because our time is so limited, and to the extent we're in the midst of a generative conversation, I might not force us to leave it, but that's where we're headed. So again, I'll start with some very quick intros of this all-star panel that I'm so honored and privileged to have with me for this conversation today. So we have really in no particular order, just based on the boxes on my screen: Professor Latoya Baldwin-Clark at UCLA, Professor Aziz Rana, I think maybe that direction from me over at BC, and Professor Asla Bali, who's at Yale Law School. They are simply the best, and so thank you all for being with us. Let me do a little stage setting, scene setting. One could go back further, and I hope we do go back further in our conversation, but I'm going to start with the summer of 2020. I think it can be hard to remember how that just physically felt in our bodies. COVID was spiking in ways that were often terrifying. There was unprecedented global protest for racial justice. There was also a looming presidential election. And there was this somewhat unprecedented appetite for anti-racism, maybe fleeting. And late summer, then President Trump connects with right-wing strategist Christopher Rufo, at the time not well known, now is much better known. And that opens up this new front that we might think of as anti-racist backlash. Much of it at the time began being rehearsed through anti-CRT talking points and rhetoric. And that rhetoric then gets codified into an executive order that President Trump issues in, I believe, September of 2020. But we all know sort of how at least some of this story goes. Biden wins the election, Biden rescinds the executive order, and I think his first act in office. So the question is, does this anti-racist backlash subside? That's the question, and the answer is no. Buttressed from a network of right-wing entities, folks like the Heritage Foundation, ALEC, and members of former President Trump's administration, they essentially empowered GOP officials across the country to propose and pass what are described as anti-CRT laws. I think it's fair to say the design is of these laws and this broader project is to, on the one hand, denigrate anti-racist values, but also to censor conversations about race or racism and other targeted topics like gender identity, sexual orientation. Borrowing from Catherine Russell Brown at the University of Florida, I've begun to think of these as anti-racial literacy laws, not just anti-literacy laws, but anti-racial literacy laws. And as of today, if you look at CRT Forward, and I will do a very quick plug for CRT Forward, project out of the Critical Race Studies program at UCLA that Professor Baldwin Clark has helped lead. They have been documenting, analyzing all of the quote unquote anti-CRT laws that have been proposed and passed. And as of today, at least based on their metrics, 247 entities, the state, federal, and local entities have introduced over 860 such laws. And these laws that have been passed now blanket the country. Over half of our public school students are in what we might think of as a discriminatory censorship regime. Over 20 million students, over 1 million teachers. In the past year, there's been something of a sharp turn where attacks that were rhetorically focused on CRT are now increasingly focused on DEI. And that rhetoric is also leading to legislation. Attacks on DEI aren't new, but the focus maybe is. And this is ongoing. So just 3 quick data points. And then another data point. And then I'm going to ask some questions to the panelists. So in July, University of Missouri eliminates its diversity office following GOP attacks. University of Missouri is not alone. In August, Louisiana's governor issues an executive order ostensibly banning critical race theory, but like pretty much all critical race theory bans, is trading on caricatures of CRT. On Monday, 3 days from now, and this data point is something that maybe strikes at home for lawyers, law professors, and law students. Monday's the final day to submit comments on the ABA's proposed revision to Rule 206, which was previously titled Diversity and Inclusion, and as of today requires ABA schools to demonstrate by concrete action a commitment to diversity and inclusion by providing full opportunities for the study of law and entry into the profession by members of underrepresented groups, particularly racial and ethnic minorities, and a commitment to having a student body that is diverse with respect to gender, race, and ethnicity. The proposals strip reference to diversity, reference to inclusion, and reference to race, ostensibly, driven by the Supreme Court's affirmative action decision last year to suggest that reveals a misunderstanding of equal protection doctrine. Not really our focus for right now, but it's all our focus. So final data point. This morning, as I was prepping, it struck me that the states that have, ostensibly banned CRT or DEI seem to be like the same states that are also attacking reproductive autonomy, seem to be the states attacking voting rights and public education. And if you just Google map of, and then put those things, CRT, reproductive freedom, voting rights, public education in that box, you get a very similar map. And this is just meant to, at least for now, to be observation, that the attacks on CRT are part of other attacks that we might see as, foundational to our multiracial democracy. I've already gone over time. That's too much for me, and I really want to bring in our panelists. And I'm going to start by a question that perhaps, invites us to think about some of the tension between CRT and DEI, though you should all tell me if I'm sort of manufacturing this tension. I think it is safe to say that 4 years ago, when the country was experiencing this anti-racist moment, a lot of folks on the left, particularly those who would identify with projects like critical race theory, were at least skeptical of DEI type initiatives, maybe even critical. But today, many of those folks are closing ranks around DEI. And so just as a question to get us going, is this an accurate observation, this tension? and what explains the shift from skepticism to support? I'll just open it up unless it's helpful for me to call in the folks.
I'd be happy to jump in if I can start just to frame a couple of things about why this relationship between CRT and DEI. So at base somewhere, right, we have to concede that frameworks for thinking about issues of race, social justice, and systemic inequality are shared premises for both critical race theory and diversity, equity, inclusion. In fact, many of the diversity, equity, inclusion programs and initiatives borrowed from foundational insights from CRT around systemic inequalities, around thinking of race as a social construct, around historical barriers to equity in admissions and recruitment and retention and in professional mentorship at universities. But there was obviously a really strong ground for the CRT critiques of DEI, including an excessive focus on performative and tokenized strategies for addressing diversity without engaging systemic issues of race and inequality, because at base, universities are institutions, and institutions want, on the one hand, to engage with some of these questions that are being raised, and on the other hand, are reluctant, actually, to engage in thoroughgoing systemic change. And so, in a way, DEI became a mechanism, at least from the perspective of some critical scholars, for undermining calls for broader reforms or performing something superficial in the place of genuine commitment to change. And so you had excessive focus, for example, on individual behaviors and attitudes of prejudice rather than some of the structural conditions that were producing outcomes across academia globally. You had the worry that diversity was getting commodified in a way, that we were engaging in some branding around, CRT concepts instead of deep engagement with them. And also to the extent that CRT came to be identified with intersectionality, intersectional conceptions, oftentimes DEI did not think in these terms at all, but rather had a kind of individual check the box of characteristics approach to thinking about diversity on our campuses without necessarily even introducing meaningful mechanisms for accountability in places where institutions fell short. So all of these were good reasons to have, questions. But on the other hand, the attacks on DEI are just an extension, for the reasons that you've yourself described, of existing attacks on CRT as divisive. And so it's those foundational original commitments to addressing racial inequity, systemic discrimination, et cetera, out of which DEI grew, that's under attack. So the attack today, the backlash today, which you described, is a backlash that is simply against all the things that CRT and DEI had in common. For which reason, of course, it makes perfect sense that we are in a very different position. But I see Aziz's hand up, and I don't want to, I want to give way. So I'll stop there with the original framing, and so we can spend a little more time about the stakes today.
Oh, yeah, so I just basically was going to give a concrete example that I think that in political practice, what many folks on the left were most suspicious of, and this wasn't even necessarily in universities, probably more so in business and Fortune 500 companies, was the way in which there was this translation of a shared agreement of structural racial injustice to, well, what is it that the big institutions are going to do about it? And what you saw was the proliferation of a particular kind of consultant, so that individuals would come into these institutions, give workshops, focus especially on individual psychological experiences and preferences, fundamentally disconnected from underlying economic and class experiences. And a very simple thing that many left activists said was that, well, if Coca-Cola or name your company really cares about issues of racial injustice, well, why doesn't it actually just treat its employees better? Why does it actually just simply engage in practices that are supportive of labor? Because that actually has a transformative material effect on various minority communities on the ground, instead of giving large sums of money to individuals to come in and engage in various kinds of consultancy efforts. And so that there was a real concern that the translation was essentially stripping all of the substantive content of the CRT analysis from the discussion when it came to issues of racial justice. And then, to talk about the present, I think what's really telling is that the attacks and the focus of the attacks have really in the present been on what we can think of as one of the great achievements, honestly, of the last few years, which is creating a context in which there's pressure within a variety of institutions, including academic institutions, to actually have people in the buildings in positions of authority that are taking these questions seriously and are also engaged in academic knowledge production in a way that previously had not existed. So this is the point, Jonathan, you're making about racial literacy, which has been just as central to academic institutions in higher ed as it is at the primary through high school level. And so many of these attacks are really fundamental attacks on the shared premises between CRT and DEI, but also just on factual knowledge about the nature of the society within which we live. And it's one of the reasons why, from our perspective in 2024, this is something that's deeply troubling, regardless of where you might have stood in those debates 4 years ago.
If I could just add just a little bit, and perhaps give another example of the tension between CRT and DEI and where we are right now. So if we think of CRT as being really about this constructive program of actually interrogating race, interrogating structural inequality, what the law looks like, how we go about from a reform to a retrenchment. Whereas I always saw DEI as being more about programs and incentives that quote unquote would increase diversity, talk about the experience of being a racially diverse person on a campus in schools or in universities. And to the extent, I didn't always really share many of the harsh critiques of DEI. Except to the extent that folks thought DEI was the answer to whatever our racial structural inequalities would be. And if I could just give a very little example of this, I do a lot of work in schools. And one of the things is I tried to start a DEI committee, but from my point of view, DEI meant really going into structural inequalities. How do we make sure that Black kids are getting all of the same access? But what really DEI ended up turning into were PTA events in which we said, oh, we want everyone to come and let's share our cultural foods and make everyone feel as though, now something about this group of people, right? So that's an example, I think, of the difference between what we're thinking about as a CRT analysis versus thinking about DEI. And I'll just, really echo what Asla and Aziz have also said, which is that both of these types of attacks are really about dismantling higher education as we see it, right? And the ability of our children to understand racial subordination because that's the society in which we live. And I think the stakes are maybe a little bit higher, only in the sense that, these attacks on DEI are also being used by colleges and universities to crack down on student protesters by saying you're not being inclusive of other folks, right? And so that's also, I think, we're part of the tension between CRT and DEI, and why the stakes are perhaps a little higher when, universities call police on their students.
If I could just jump in one more second to say something about some of these examples. I mean, these examples are excellent examples that illustrate where the differences obviously lie. But what they also reflect is that nobody who could ever have criticized any of these DEI initiatives from at least a CRT or a left perspective could endorse or co-sign a rolling back on commitments to diversity, which is what we're actually seeing now. And the irony that Latoya just pointed to, which is on the one hand, these anti-DEI and more broadly, of course, anti-CRT initiatives that claim that DEI curricular diversification has resulted in some kind of a misrepresentation of American history because of a focus on race or a focus on histories of slavery or a focus on structural discrimination or now settler colonialism, of course, a concept, all of these divisive concepts. This is an attack on the one hand that seeks to literally erase and then rewrite American history for the purposes of a different political project of retrenchment. And on the other hand, so it's a censorious effort to intervene in curricula to reframe them around a particular ideological project while simultaneously presenting DEI as itself an assault on academic freedom, as somehow a way of undermining the free speech and ability of persons that are critics of diversity from being able to express their views on campuses. And so just as we're now seeing many of these same right-wing actors weaponize diversity and anti-discrimination language to further their political agendas on our campuses, so we see the very groups that were engaging in censorship now arguing that they are facing forms of censorship that require further dismantling of DEI. So it's just like the ways in which we have a kind of boomerang occurring in which it's both the argument and its contrary in the service of an ideological project is really striking, and it comes across most clearly in the kinds of diversity examples. So on the one hand, we don't want those diverse PTA meetings, or we don't want curricula that reflect inclusivity. And on the other hand, we're very worried, say the same right-wing ideologues, that our particular identity is being excluded, or our particular identity is under assault. And in those circumstances, we make use of anti-discrimination language in order to engage in a call to order.
So there's just so much fertile ground here and so many places to go. In a moment, I'm going to shift to Aziz and ask you a historical question that sort of invites us to look backwards and sort of situate the current moment and attacks on curriculum. But just another example of this really critical observation that the attacks on diversity and DEI are deploying the conceptions of racial harm, often at times, that were incubated in critical race theory. Or another way to think about it is civil rights laws are both under attack by Project 2025 and being used by Project 2025 to stamp out campus protest. And Title VI is an example. So if you heard any of the congressional hearings in which university presidents were brought before Virginia Fox's Committee on Education and Workforce, underlying it was this notion that campus protests were, for one reason or another, or the university's failure to respond was violating their Title VI obligations to, in effect, ensure the absence of racial hostility on campus. At the same time, Project 2025, the document whose name everyone now knows, calls for eliminating the Office of Civil Rights, which is and the Department of Education, but which is the bureaucratic unit, the federal agency that is actually positioned to ensure that universities are upholding the civil rights of their students. And so both of these things are happening at the same time. But so let me turn to Aziz and just help us bring in sort of a historical sort of frame so that we're not just focused on the past 4 years. And you've written about education wars, or like similar sorts of fights over curriculum from the early 20th century, from essentially 100 years ago. I'm just wondering if you can help us surface some of the parallels or links that thread from then till now. And then I have this, I'm going to add this other question that you don't have to answer, but it's just in my mind, which is, actually, no, I'm going to hold off. So the question is just help us sort of understand the historical links between then and now, and then maybe I'll toss in another question.
Yeah, so I think it's really important to appreciate the extent to which this is essentially a 100-year plus story. And there are two elements of it that I think are worth unpacking. So the first is we tend, especially folks that have been connected broadly or see themselves in the achievements of the civil rights movement, to think of the language of American universalism, the countries committed to principles of freedom and equality, as necessarily an anti-racist language. And so there's something really strange about the range of these contemporary attacks, whether the anti-CRT, quote unquote, CRT bills or the attacks on DEI, using the language of universalism and formal racial equality as a way of essentially undermining anti-racist racial justice efforts. And so there's a strangeness to it. You expect the language of racial reaction to speak in terms of ethnic nationalism and explicit white supremacy. So that needs to be unpacked. And then the second thing is, like, why the schools, both public schools and universities? Why has that been such a sight? So on the first, I think it's really important to appreciate that in the 20th century, and this is after the Civil War, after Reconstruction, and the rise of a particular language of the U.S. is tied to certain principles embedded in the Declaration of Independence, supposed to have been given teeth through the 14th Amendment, there is a mainstreaming to a partial extent within Northern society of a specific story of American universalism. Now, that mainstreaming has a very uneasy mix with the fact that the country systematically is still organized as a white republic. And so that you have explicitly white supremacist arguments, and then you also have this language that's associated with Reconstruction, the Republican Party, both white and black anti-slavery activists. And in the 20th century, the way that uneasy mix ends up getting solved is in part because of the fact that the US now finds itself increasingly in a global community in which the old imperial orders are breaking down, and that decolonization globally is transforming the kinds of arguments that are acceptable for Americans to make. The US cannot articulate itself, this is if you're a Northern white official, as just explicitly a white republic like white South Africa or white Australia, that there's an effort to reconstruct the meaning of national identity. And especially in the North and the South, one of the ways in which that's solved is by claiming this language of universalism. The US has been committed to freedom and equality from the founding, from the Declaration of Independence through the Constitution, through the Civil War to the 20th century. But that commitment is very closely tied to the particular ethno-cultural experience of a specific subset of the national community. And that's Euro-American Protestants, and then more generally Euro-Americans. That this is a group that through their experience of settlement and transformation of North America ended up building a universal country, and they as a group are exceptional, and what they offer the world is exceptional. And this is a combination of universality and particularity that in the North and the West becomes a really powerful language of racial reaction. So that the dominant language of racial reaction is actually explicitly a language that would seem to be universal. The claim is not that you still have eugenicist arguments, but increasingly over the first half of the 20th century, it's not that Black people or other minorities are biologically less capable. It's that there are these cultural differences that require effectively like white American tutelage, and so then justify various forms of hierarchy, and also that attacks on a kind of bedrock American universalism or assumptions about American universalism is attacks on the very foundation of the country. And you see this passed in a series of education bills starting in the 1920s. And indeed, we have education bills that interestingly parallel almost exactly some of the stuff that has emerged more recently. So Wisconsin in 1923 passes a bill that says that bans using textbooks and teaching in public schools false narratives about the revolution. And of course, just like today, many of the progressive educators at the time were like, well, nobody's teaching false narratives about the revolution. I mean, who is this? But it was obviously used as a way of chilling alternative forms of education within the school system. And in fact, you could have individuals, so parents, sue the school board contesting the curriculum and the textbooks that are being used, just like you might have in Florida today. And the purpose was to create a context or climate in which more open-ended and critical arguments were essentially excluded from the conversation. And then that leads to the question about like, why the schools? It's really important to appreciate that public education in the US is one of the truly great progressive achievements with all the problems around it of the first half of the 20th century. And attacks on schooling became a very, an accessible and successful way for disparate elements of an emerging conservative coalition to find common cause. Because abstracted from the particular debates around schools, it's not entirely clear that the business right, social conservatives that are committed to a traditionalist account of the family, and racial reactionaries that are committed to retrenchment when it comes to the politics of racial hierarchy necessarily have a ton in common. These could be quite disparate elements. But the school system, the public school system, and then more recently the university school system, is a place for all of those groups to find common cause and also to be able to mobilize a mass base of parents who might be worried about whether or not values inconsistent with their own are being presented through institutions that they don't feel like they have control over. And so it brings together, for instance, a call for school vouchers and the privatizing of the public school system with arguments about race, with arguments about gender and gender identity. And it's why we see these practices recur over time. So you see it in the 1920s, you see it in the 1950s, you see it in the 1980s, and then you see it again more recently, even if right-wing activists aren't necessarily thinking they're just replaying a playbook from the past. In practice, they are, because of the power of this as a synthesis for a set of reactionary projects.
Asa, Latoya, either of you want to jump in on this thread before I send a question over to Latoya?
I mean, I'll just say that I will comment later on exactly how this is reemerging in this moment, because I think it really does, Aziz has done a brilliant job of showing us the connections, the historical through line.
And I do want to name a couple things just to sort of highlight it or reinforce it from Aziz's point. One is just the way that the language of universalism and sort of equality is what animates all of the anti-racial literacy laws. And so I'm just going to read now from the Louisiana governor's recent executive order, which starts, whereas pursuant to Louisiana Constitution, the goal of the public educational system is to provide learning environments and experiences that are humane, just, and designed to promote excellence in order that every individual may be afforded an equal opportunity to develop his or her full potential. And so that is, and then going into this deeply regressive sort of retrenchment type effort, but starting there. And Randy Fine, the sponsor of Florida's Stop Woke Act, who is very comfortable on the record saying that it is important to protect against claims that America is not exceptional. And there is this inextricable link between a particular understanding of patriotism and protecting America from criticism or critique. So Latoya, let me turn over to you. And so as has been noted, Christopher Rufo is one of the individuals, though supported by a much broader network, that helped to organize the anti-critical race theory attacks and talking points. As early as March 2021, he had openly admitted that this was just this was effectively a communications campaign that was not about some substantive fight over what is actually in this thing we call critical race theory, but designed to stigmatize, delegitimize inclusionary projects. We also know that he publicly urged, his folks to employ a very similar communication strategy against DEI, particularly after October 7th, and particularly against the backdrop of campus protest. And given all the incredible work you've done, sort of teasing out the rhetorical dimension of these attacks, I'm wondering if you can help, just sort of understand the rhetorical links, because sometimes I feel like there's just this template, just like a Word doc that Chris Rufo has, and he replaces CRT with DEI and one other word with one other word, but the script is largely the same, almost like a Mad Lib board. And so can you just help us sort of map or understand some of the rhetorical dimensions of these attacks?
Sure. So in a way, starting with what you just said, I think I was reading yesterday and I can't remember where I found it, where actually Christopher Rufo makes this argument where he says, this is basically a strategy that has worked before, and we're going to keep using the same strategy until it doesn't work anymore. And so that's what his plan is. And he's been very successful in these spaces. So what are some of the rhetorical links that we see? So for example, there's several of them, right? So for example, in the anti-CRT movement, it was often said that even talking about anti-racism was per se racist, right? We talk about race, that means it has to be per se racist. The same thing is happening with pro-Palestinian speech or speech that's critical of Israel as a state. It really is setting up this baseline presumption of invalidity that actually must be overcome until such speech is actually deemed acceptable. And so we see that in both of the movements. We see things like it's illegitimate to say that the United States is a fundamentally racist country, in the same way now that it's illegitimate to call Israel a racist country and an apartheid state. And it's very much about using these words as being taboo words. These are things that we simply cannot say. I mean, it's very ironic. Again, I think, as John, as you had said, was that rather than engage with the argument, it really just takes certain ideas completely off of the table. And that was happening in the anti-CRT movement, as well as thinking about the anti-DEI movement. this idea of redefining these freedom phrases. I think, John, as you called them, so freedom phrases like Black Lives Matter, thinking about free Palestine or from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, again, as things that are presumptively violent, therefore legitimizing state violence that actually goes about quelling that speech. And there's this assumption not only that the speech is presumptively violent, but that the people who are using the speech are presumptively violent people. That was what was happening when we were thinking about CRT. Black people are dangerous. Now we're thinking about anti-Semitism and pro-Palestinian speech with the idea that those people are naturally violent people, right? So we're seeing that same type of parallel. And then one last thing I would say is that we're seeing a parallel between who we are most concerned about when it comes to their feelings about having uncomfortable conversations. So what was happening in the CRT movement was very much, we don't want to bring up race because white children are going to feel bad about themselves. They're going to feel guilty. And that's just something that's uncomfortable for them. And we're seeing some of the same issue here of saying that uncomfortable speech is speech that we must not actually use because it's going to make some students feel uncomfortable versus other students. And it's very much about having not very much concern at all about the subjective experiences of some students versus the subjective experiences of other students. And so we're seeing that parallel too. And then lastly, I'll say, this is of course all very, very ironic because several years ago, the complaint was that, oh, these students are snowflakes. I can't believe that they need safe spaces. They can't hear anything that is about, thinking about what might be reasons for why there's racial inequality that doesn't have anything to do with racial discrimination. And now we're seeing exactly the same type of idea, that the university needs to be a particularly safe space in this particular way. But that's very ironic because we were calling students snowflakes just several years ago. And we're not using that same rhetoric anymore, which I think is just really, really interesting.
And on this point, in a moment, I'm gonna direct a question to Asa, but there is also this sense that I have that I think is not totally off base, that when it came to sort of that prior narrative Latoya was describing, the sort of ridiculing the idea of safe spaces, mocking notions, and not everyone, but at least, a sort of palpable sort of denigration of concepts like microaggressions, that was against the backdrop of this sort of national discourse that was expressing existential angst in certain ways about this supposed free speech crisis on campus. And the culprit of that supposed free speech crisis was often DEI sort of initiatives. But as we mentioned at the outset, right now in the country, half of our public school students are living under regimes that are designed to prevent them from learning certain concepts. We see tenured faculty members now fired for seemingly quite innocuous social media content. And just to say that people are getting canceled, but somehow that is not activating a broader free speech crisis frame. Maybe it's a culture war frame, maybe it's a more sort of just murky frame, but there's something I think palpably different in the way that sort of international discourse or even academic discourse, the sort of framing is different, even if similar concerns are being mobilized in different in those respective contexts. But so Asla, I want to turn to you now just to help us get a more comprehensive sense of the sort of the political, legal, or just infrastructural backdrop that really enabled folks like Rufo or the Heritage Foundation or the House GOP leadership to really cynically but effectively weaponize campus protest in ways that led to images that we all saw on screens of just violent treatment of peaceful students, staff, faculty. So to help us sort of map the backdrop.
Great, thank you. And this is where I think I pick up from that history that Aziz was telling, because I think the best way to understand this is that there is a broader ideological project to remake the normative landscape of our national politics. And it's through that lens that we can understand the contradictions where, in one instance, what they perceive as an ideological project connected to CRT or DEI, they understand to be ascendant on campuses. Now the concern is free speech and ensuring that critical speech of that project is going to get a fair airing. But at a moment when they see an opportunity for cultural ascendance themselves, the critical thing is to shut down any scrutiny of the ideological project they're advancing. But to get there, let me just back up a second and say first, like a little bit about the Rufo strategy itself, and then how it connects to a broader political economic ecosystem. So Rufo became a prominent advocate against what he describes as woke ideology in education, and he framed, of course, both CRT and later DEI in these terms, because he was able to use traditional and social media platforms to amplify this messaging. That's how he made himself such an effective strategist. And the strategic campaigns targeted specific individuals or incidents to portray campuses in ways that emphasized themes of fear and urgency. That there's a debate afoot in which campus engagements with the question of race are actually part of this broader cultural threat. And there's a battlefield of cultural warfare actually happening on our campuses. Post October 7th, it became possible to converge that narrative with literal conflict that's taking place abroad and present campuses as little microcosms in which the urgency of the battle to prevail on the campus is actually part of a broader campaign in which we express our support for a foreign government, for its waging of war, for American foreign policy, for all these things. So like you literally turn campuses into a cauldron of what you're presenting as this kind of warfare, then you're successful in ways that basically scramble the partisan divide ideologically. Like I have parents in their 80s and 90s who really were pretty far removed from the kinds of platforms that a person like Chris Rufo was present on. They really were not aware of the anti-DEI, anti-CRT, et cetera project. It was just, a bridge too far from the core kinds of things at their age and in their cultural sphere they were aware of. But once we're in the post-October 7th environment in which it's possible to connect up that project with this broader set of foreign policy concerns about the status of America's support for Israel, et cetera, now my mom is on the phone telling me not to bring my 9-year-old near my campus at Yale University because it's so dangerous, so violent, evidently on that campus, as she's hearing from not just the right-wing media sphere, but from NPR, from whatever cultural, touchstone she has for American news, that she's genuinely worried that our safety will be compromised by being on campus. So this this ability to reframe is really critical, because what happens is Rufo, just as one high-profile example of the broader phenomenon of right-wing think tanks and their money, as I say, trying to reshape a normative landscape in our national politics regarding public understandings of race and social justice in our democracy, to pursue an attack on core democratic commitments along the lines that Aziz was describing, to revert to their preferred account of universality and particularity as against a universal narrative that tries to use American ideological projects in the name of of advancing a racial anti-discrimination project and a project about the ways that systemic racism has become embedded globally in our country, to take that and connect it now to a political project that already had a really significant platform in American politics and media. So let me connect this to where we began with anti-CRT, because to understand the project that's now gotten connected up to Israel-Palestine, it's important to see, to begin with, and the connections to Aziz's history, the anti-Blackness that's at the heart of those efforts. And this was also clear in the framing comments you provided, John. There were, efforts to suppress histories of slavery, efforts to suppress accounts of the first Reconstruction or the Civil Rights Movement, and to promote a kind of retrenchment politics against social movement advocacy following the racial justice uprising of 2020 in particular, efforts to rewrite our history. And those were tied up with broader politics around undermining voting rights, seeking to dismantle support for public education, explicit targeting of inclusive curricula for censorship. So a remaking of our national politics and our national normative landscape around the weaponization of colorblindness. And, projects that sought to transform campaigns against racial discrimination into campaigns to address reverse discrimination or anti-white racism. That was the cultural moment we were in before October 7th. Once you connect October 7th along the lines that Latoya's, rhetorical through lines have shown us, you're able to turn that into a much broader political project of ensuring that certain kinds of ideas cannot have a home on our campuses and that other ideas are promoted actively. And in doing this, you have already a pre-existing ecosystem of right-wing think tanks and donors who have been engaged in that prior project of reshaping higher education. And these activist donors have supported and consolidated the backlash politics that precedes October 7th and are now in a position of really controlling narratives at American universities, whether they be public universities or private universities. So you have the donors that make up a very large proportion of the boards of trustees of private universities, but also people with similar backgrounds and political and economic power, determining the composition of public boards that are appointed by governors as regents of public universities. And in both cases, you have a kind of gerrymander that's taking place of the composition of university governance, such that you can, impose a top-down agenda about how we are to think about a critical question of national import in this given moment, and enable powerful actors with connections to universities to promote a narrative of these universities are in a situation of chaos. This unrest represents violence. There is a fundamental threat to the public that's emanating from these campuses. So you have very powerful actors with very large bullhorns and with very deep connections to across the board traditional media and social media amplifying these messages now. It's not Chris Rufo alone. It's not just Chris Rufo's connections, but it is still distinctly connected to these right-wing agendas. So for example, when you look at donor-driven hiring in the academy, what you find over the last decade is the proliferation of centers funded by donors on university campuses, like the Koch brothers, funding hundreds of centers over, some 300 campuses, and determining who's going to be hired as directors at these centers and so forth. And then you have a political economy of higher education that is dependent upon this donor stream, this funding of centers, this funding of programs, the kinds of individuals that end up being able to be on seats of boards of trustees. And when they collectively say, absolutely not, when they use their collective power to say, we will not tolerate this kind of speech, or that kind of speech represents a form of intolerable discrimination, reverse discrimination on campuses, university administrators get cowed. You have coordinated campaigns with conservative lawmakers, resulting in the kinds of inquiries and hearings that we saw out of the subcommittees and committees on the House. And all of a sudden, the pre-existing backdrop, the political economy of higher education that had already formed post-October 7th, basically becomes a cudgel through which to demand a call to order on campuses and withdraw support from faculty and curricula that are deemed critical, engage in, to borrow your phrase, John, a control F strategy of going through curricula and saying which syllabi have the phrase Middle East or the word Palestine or what have you in it, and deciding both what needs to be purged in terms of what's taught on our campuses, who needs to be purged in terms of the personnel on our campuses, and calls for extreme discipline to crack down on particular students that take views that are at odds with the preferences of the political machinery, the political economic machinery that now has such a very large role in the governance of higher education.
So I have a few reactions, but I want to pause in case Latoya or Aziz want to jump in on any of this.
So I guess I was just going to say one thing, that I also think it's really important to appreciate the extent to which this story is part of a project of effectively attempting to resegregate higher education in the United States. So that one of really the great achievements of the civil rights movement was just a transformation in who occupied the same institutional spaces: workplaces, businesses, universities, also public schools. And that this was significant because of the way in which, when you bring folks from different backgrounds, so this is like the integration project, but particularly people that are working class backgrounds across racial divides, you create these distinct cultural worlds in which you have an airing for perspectives and positions that historically had not been present. And it's also why I think one of the central kinds of claims that went hand in hand with this effort was a basic principle of both like anti-humiliation, that like the type of background, like cultural norms or expectations that sustained like white supremacy in the past were no longer acceptable, and also that the kinds of ideas that had shaped sort of excluded perspectives would now actually be given a serious hearing as part of our understanding of the past. So somebody like W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in 1935 doesn't get reviewed by any major academic space, but Black Reconstruction now becomes like a central text in the understanding of the American experience. And instead, over like the last half century, one of the key efforts of the American right is to roll back that project across a number of different institutions. And so that you're seeing heightened forms of resegregation in public schools, in neighborhoods, in churches, like you name it. But one of the places, there are really two institutions that in a way had like resisted these developments. One is the military and the other is like universities. And in a sense, you can look at these projects, including the way in which they've gone into hyperdrive over the last year, as an effort to fundamentally break down the essential like unit, the cultural unit of universities of higher education as places in which contesting ideas would actually get a hearing, which concepts that emerge from the global south or concepts that emerge out of the scholarship of scholars and academics that have traditionally been excluded, not because of the depth or seriousness about their ideas, but because of the demographic composition effectively of who occupied those institutions. How do you actually turn back the clock? This is not to say that universities, even before this moment, were necessarily institutions of transformation. Lots of different ways in which universities reproduce, in particular, economic forms of privilege. But there were one place in which you had this really interesting mix, effectively, of academic freedom and arguments that were on behalf of some account of racial justice. That there's a presumption in the popular conversation that these two things are opposed, when in a deep sense, like a context of free speech and academic freedom goes hand in hand with taking seriously the ideas, perspectives that would allow us to think critically about the conditions under which we live. And so what we're seeing now is an effort effectively to turn back the clock and to make the university much more like the other sites of American life that have been resegregated.
And just if I could add one thing to this, to go back to the original framing question you had, John, by framing their critiques in terms of legal protections against discrimination, these actors that Aziz is describing are seeking to create institutional change on campuses in higher education across the country that aligns with their political agenda, namely to enact the rollback that Aziz just described, by repurposing existing instruments of state power that were once designed to enable precisely the kinds of moves of inclusion of an earlier moment of the last generation that Aziz was pointing to. And so it's that tension that we began with of how is it that these instruments of anti-discrimination, which were long the target of these campaigns, and indeed in SFFA and elsewhere, have themselves come to be dismantled, are also at the same moment being repurposed and redeployed for the purpose of institutionalizing the right-wing agenda. I think that's the thing that maybe our whole panel is kind of convened to think through.
So I'm just so glad to be part of this conversation because it's so rich. But I want to, I think want to build on a couple things that have, or just connect a couple points. So one, Aziz noting that sort of military universities are one place that places, for all their imperfections, maybe many imperfections, have been able to realize some semblance of racial integration or desegregation. And just questions about sort of framing. And so SFFA was just brought up. I'm teaching education law right now. Many of us teach, classes like that or constitutional law. And generally, we categorize the Supreme Court's desegregation jurisprudence as ending maybe in Milliken or in 1974, so 50 years ago, or in Jenkins, case involving Kansas City, Missouri, 20 years later. And then we think about Bakke, Grutter, SFFA as affirmative action, as if these projects of inclusion are not part of the project of integration or desegregation. But if SFFA, if we are teaching it as, maybe the end, or not the end, but part of this broader arc of the Supreme Court's sort of desegregation jurisprudence that peaks in the late 1960s, like 1970, and then from there is increasingly undermining the project of Brown by marshaling Brown and the 14th Amendment. Because then you get to this case SFFA, in which the reason why universities can't take modest steps to racially integrate or desegregate, particularly a place like UNC, where most of its history was actively resisting desegregation, you have a court that is preventing that project and pointing to the precedent that requires that project at the same time. And then just like two other quick points, and I'll ask maybe a final question. One is just thinking about the ideology of universities. So there is this broad public narrative that universities are these left places, but that misunderstands the way how power is wielded within universities, because it may be that employees of universities, the professors, are overwhelmingly maybe sort of on one side of the some ideological spectrum. I actually think that's probably overstating things. But even if that's true, professors are labor. Professors are not like the corporation. And so it would be as if we think that Amazon is woke because all of Amazon's employees are like anti-racist advocates. And there's just this way in which our inability to, or the way in which the certain politics of certain employees within institutions is then projected as the institution's ideological predisposition, which sort of similar to Aziz's earlier point about where if Coca-Cola wants to engage in like a meaningful project of, economic, racial sort of progressivism, universities could just stop fighting the unionization of university workers. But that's certainly not happening. So that's enough, commentary adding on. I think I'll stop with a final question, which is either just going to invite any additional thoughts on anything that we haven't yet covered that folks want to add, but also any reactions to the increasing turn to quote unquote neutrality. One thing we've seen after the past year is that there was some problem, and ostensibly that problem was universities' failure to adhere to a commitment to institutional neutrality. There's been a lot of folks who've criticized that, like either that on the grounds that you shouldn't be neutral or you can't be neutral. And I'm just interested in how you all think about the calls for neutrality. Is it desirable? Is it practical? Is it a false promise? We've got 3 minutes, so I'll give everyone a minute to respond to that or anything else.
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent point. I would say not only the turn to neutrality, which I think we all know is quite impossible. There's no such thing as neutrality. I also want to just bring up quickly, not necessarily the point of this, but also the turn to civility, this idea that now even these very hard ideas that we need to be civil when we talk about them. I've also found that to be quite fascinating as a mode of quelching dissent. And I think that the idea of neutrality is also a mode to quelch dissent, or to at least, I want to say, like, neutralize dissent, right? The idea is that, well, yes, these bad things are happening, but we have to stay neutral, whatever that happens to mean. And generally, I think it means that the university is staying on the side of power, and that idea is that, if we're on the side of power, that means we're being neutral. And I think that that's just absolutely not at all true.
So I'll jump in to just say very quickly that there are many ways we could think about what those calls mean. I personally think the idea that a university doesn't need to have a Ministry of Foreign Affairs makes sense to me, in the sense that, the flying of Ukrainian flags on every campus across the country, et cetera, set a kind of precedent that then means that you're weighing in on topics that are really quite far removed from the sort of mission, the collective mission, let's say, of the university. The challenge with the neutrality calls is how that mission gets defined, I think, and on what topics we decide collectively that we don't need to weigh in, that are beyond that mission, and which ones are within that mission. And to my mind, particularly racial politics within this country are critical to understanding the role of higher education, the experience of our students, the experiences you just described in terms of the political economy of higher education, and cannot be beyond the mandate And so it really depends on how we draw those lines. I want to leave time for Aziz.
Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, so I think I'm probably in a similar place, which is, in theory, I don't have a problem with institutional neutrality on issues that don't go to the core of like the mission of the academic place. And then there's a question, as Asla highlighted, about like, well, then how do you define that mission? But to me, like the problem really has been, how is it that that neutrality then gets exercised in practice? Because there's so much given the joints in terms of judgment left about what seems to be neutral practices, but have profoundly disparate effects. And I think that's just one embodiment of something that we're seeing recur over and over and over again, which is, I think there was a sense among some sort of left liberal activists broadly committed to racial justice out of the experience of the civil rights movement, which is, if you make a particular argument, then outcomes come from it. Like if you make an argument on behalf of equality, then it has a clear ideological valence. But really, like the long history in the country is that any of these frames are deeply contested and have been used for various kinds of purposes, including nefarious purposes. Even if we just go back to the 14th Amendment, like the 14th Amendment almost immediately becomes reconstructed as a defense, explicit defense of segregation, and as a tool of business to crack down on workers. And so it's not like we're seeing new strategies of employing like rhetoric to operate in these complex and complicated ways. And it's just, I think it's important in the present to name them, and also to name these contradictions. For instance, one thing that we haven't discussed is a great deal of the way, for instance, identity politics gets framed is to highlight the sense that if somebody is talking about racial justice or using the language that comes from the global South about decolonization, then somehow that's a product of their own subjective experience, rather than an objective analysis of a set of social conditions. Whereas the reason why you can marshal identity politics as something that's only articulated by some groups within institutions is a background judgment that, that dominant constituencies have no identity, or like that there's a kind of blank slate where previous forms of scholarship essentially operate definitionally as objective. And all of this is stuff that has to be like confronted, named, and contested in order for us to be able to ensure that the terms that have had these mobilizing transformative effects don't again become tools for the retrenchment of various forms of reaction.
Well, we're at 102, and I promised a hard stop at 1. And so I'm going to end by thanking our panelists for giving us their time, and for everyone who joined us today. We can't see you, but a thank you to everyone. I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend.